SwiftCharts is a great tool to include charts in your SwiftUI apps, but sometimes it can be hard to really grasp what you can do with this. That is why in this tutorial I'm going to build a larger, more complex app with lots of different data and chart types. This is on the one hand to show you as many examples for charts as possible, and on the other, how do you prepare your data so it works together with SwiftCharts. This is a more advanced tutorial. If you have never worked with SwiftCharts, please have a look at my introduction to SwiftCharts before you start building on this project. The project we are going to work on is an app for bookstore owners, and we're showing a lot of different statistics so that the person can optimize their sales process and also track the progress. This project is going to work on iOS, so you see here on the iPhone and also on the iPad, and I also included this here for macOS. SwiftCharts works together with SwiftUI, so you can use it on all Apple platforms like the Mac or the Watch. And the system automatically adapts for these different platforms. This line chart gets automatically this text here. The same chart on the iPhone looks like this, and in this case it's just more dense, and they automatically adjust the sizes for this text. Because they look pretty much the same and they work the same on all these platforms, I am mostly going to focus on iOS, and you can directly then translate this to the Mac. Just wanted to mention this before. Okay, now let's go through the charts we are going to build. First, I have here a list with the main sections and a preview of each of these charts analysis. Each of these sections consists of a key takeaway, so what is the person learning from this section? For example, your book sales increased by 20% in the last 90 days. Then a preview of the data. It's a preview because we are going to hide the axes and there's no labels, no legends. The same for all the other previews of these charts. In the second section, we're showing the sales for each day of the week. And the key takeaway in this case is your highest selling day of the week is Saturday with an average of 101 sales per day. And in this case, the bluest bar is the values for Saturday. So we directly see how to combine this text with this chart. Then the next section is we analyze the different book categories and check which of them is the best-selling category for my bookstore. The preview of these statistics, I used a pie chart or donut chart because this gives you a good idea of the relationships of comparing different categories with each other. It's not so much about the exact value. And the best-selling category is fiction with 47% of all sales. And then the last section is the total expenses for the last year. So this is just an overview of how much did you spend with an area chart in this case. And I added here a little gradient to make it a little bit less prominent. All of these sections are in the NavigationStack. On macOS, I used here Navigation Switch View. So for example, for the first section, I want to show the sales per day. So it's a time evolution. I have here a picker where I can say, show me the sales for each of these days. This is in a scroll view. So we can scroll through all earlier values. Because I'm only showing here a range of 30 days at a time. You can also say go by week. I added here a different interaction. When you tap, you see the sales for this week. And I also highlight this here with a line and making this bar more prominent. And we can also group this by month. So what's the sale per month? As you see, this is all with dates. SwiftCharts is very conveniently working with dates. You will see this when we add here these labels. Then the next category was sales per day. And I show the same chart, but in this case, I'll also show here the axes and the labels. So we see exactly the values. In some cases, your data is very complex and showing everything at once might be too much. In this case, I added here 2 toggles where I can show additional information. In this case, it's show and hide the median or the average. Together here with an annotation of the exact value. The other thing I can show is, because this is an average of each of these days, how much sales there was. I could say, how much is this actually, is this really a correlation? And in this case, I'm showing here a dot for the individual days for my statistics, so I know, okay, it's really around this value. The deviation around this value is smaller than the variations over each value. So there's really a relationship here. I know this kind of chart is probably more advanced for most users and they wouldn't might not understand this. This is one of the reasons why I think it's a good idea to hide this in this case. I could have also used here a bar chart with only a range of minimum, maximum, where you only show here this area. That's also possible with bar charts. Then for the category comparison, in the detail view, I show more information, the legend, to say which book categories are shown, and give you more information. This is a donut chart because the area in the middle is empty, otherwise it would be a pie chart. And because we have some space in the middle now, we can add here some text. Pie charts, donut charts are new with iOS 17. Similar, I could use a bar chart to compare this. In this case, I make the bars go in the horizontal direction, and this is useful when you have a lot of bars that you want to show, because now I have here space for all my category names. And in this case, I added here annotations to say what are the values for each of these categories. This is nicer because you can now really dial down as user how much book sales there was for each of these categories. You could also use one single bar if you don't want to use so much space. This also gives a good idea of how much the fiction area is. Then, as an example for showing animations and how you can dynamically change data, how the chart works with this, I added here a refresh button. And I basically randomly create new sales data. In a real app, you would go and fetch this data from a server. And I say to do this with an animation. I calculate everything new for my categories. And then the chart nicely animates the changes. This is also the same for this kind of bar charts. The animation for this text is a little bit different. You see here also it nicely animates if two of these sections switches. The color updates because it uses this color for the third ranking category. We can also override and set specific colors for certain categories. But as you see, it's really nice animating. And in an app, you would do this with an animation always, because you want to make the user aware that something happened. If you too sudden make it, then they didn't realize, oh, is this actually the newest one? And they might keep on pressing refresh. So always try to do this with an animation. Then the last section was here with the total expenses. And in this case, I use a line chart with two different categories of fixed expenses and variable expenses. You can also add these gradient shadows behind by using area markers. These kind of charts is quite a lot of information because maybe the user really wants to know what was going on in each of these months. Sometimes it's a good idea, instead of charts or additionally to charts, to also use a table. This is a SwiftUI Grid where I use the same data and said, okay, for each of this month, I give the exact value for the fixed expenses, the variable, for all, and then the total again. So you can see really all of this data. Maybe instead of per month, you would go for average values, maximum, highest month with the highest and the minimum expenses, or percentages to last year, this kind of stuff. If you try to add everything in a chart, it might be a little bit too overloaded. I really like this use of these tables, or on macOS you would use a table, and on iOS we use your grids. As you see, this is a larger project with a lot of different elements, and in this tutorial we're going to gradually build up in complexity to check out all these different components. I'm creating a new project which is a multi-platform app. So you can also see this on macOS working. If you only want iOS, you can also choose only iOS. I'm calling this Bookstore Strategist. I don't use here any storage solution. I'm going to start by creating all the model files with some example data. So we are going to just use different kinds of dummy data. And this is in a new group for model. First, let's create a book category model. Swift file, book category. This is different categories, so I'm using enum, book category, and we are creating case fiction, case biography, case children, case computer science, case fantasy, and case business. Now let's add some convenience to work with SwiftUI, and obviously I need to work here with identifiable, and I also use case iteratable, so I get an array of all my different cases that we want to show. And for the ID I use self and return here self. Additionally, I wanted to show this book categories in my app, and I need to have some text to show the name of each category. So we are creating a computer property display name string, and I use a switch self statement where I just return here fiction, biography, children, computer science, fantasy, and business. Okay. Then the next one is author. Again, a Swift file. This is a struct, and again identifiable. I use an ID, which is just a UUID. And the main thing is the name. This is a string. In this case, I actually want to have some example data that I can use with my SwiftUI previews. So the first is a static var with example. I can also name this preview. This is a single example, George R. Martin. And then I also create an array of examples of authors. So this is examples. So this is J.K. Rowling, Jane Austen, Stephen King. For a lot of this example data, I used actually HTTP because then I get real book data. Next, I can now regenerate a book struct. Book. Again, a struct book with properties of ID. This is a UUID, which I want to add because I need here identifiable. And I'm also making this equatable. This is for comparing if this is the book that I'm looking at. Then the main information that I need is the book's title is a string. The author, this is our author type. The category, this is the book category we generated. Price, this is a double. Then the inventory count. I don't think I actually used this. It's complaining, so I'm adding here the protocol conforms for equatable. And for me, two books are the same if they have the same ID. So the left-hand side's ID is the same as the right-hand side's ID. Okay, maybe let's put this below. And now again, I want to generate example data. So static var example. This is one book example. In this case, I'm using Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone. This is one of the authors that we generated in the examples. Fiction, the price. Okay, now let's generate also an array of books. Examples. These are 20 books with different categories, like children, business, computer science. So we have a little bit of data to work with. Again, this is what I did with HTTP because I wanted to have this real book data. Okay, the next model I wanted to generate is sales for the sales statistics. So you can show the trend over time. Let's create a new file for sale. Again, this is a struct type, sale. A sale is for each book. So what book did we sell? How many did we sell? Quantity of int and the sales date. So we can generate our statistics of type date. Again, I add here an ID, UUID, because we want to work with SwiftUI loops before each, directly making this identifiable. Again, I make this here equatable. Now, I'm again creating some dummy data for the previews. Var example sale, and I use here one of my example sales with a random quantity. And in this case, I use the time interval since now. Again, if I generate an example, an array of my data sales as static var examples, and I use here the books that we generated with random quantities and random dates in order to make this big, because I want to really have a lot of sales over 3 months, so 90 days. So I want to generate more dummy data. And in this case, it's a good idea to randomly generate an array, a larger array. And the first thing I'm adding here is an extension to date to generate a random date in a certain range. I'm generating a random date in the last 90 days, for example. And you see here, it randomizes this. In order to actually generate this sales data, I am using the calendar, the current date. I have to go back 3 months. This is because I said I want to have for the last 3 months data. Then I generate here in range of 1 to 300 to get 300 sales points. I generate random data. First, I pick one of the example books, just a random one. I can generate a random quantity, just 1 to 5 for this sales. And I generate a random date from my current date to 3 months ago. And then I take all this data to create my sales point, which means that my example sales is an array of 300 sales points in the last 3 months. For convenience, I'm also sorting this here by the sales date. So now I have here 3 different example sales data that we can work with. And the last model I want to generate is for the expenses. Expense type, again, this is struct expense. Let title is a string, let amount is a double, and the expense date is again a date, because I want to show my expenses in a certain time range, so we can say how much per month. And maybe we add categories. So I can also generate an enum for expense category with 2 different one, case fixed and case variable. This is where we show these 2 line charts. And in order to show a name for each of these line charts, I'm creating here display name computed property, display name string, switch self, returning fixed and variable. I can now use this category in my expense type. Then again, I need to make this here identifiable with the for each in SwiftUI. And we are creating here an ID as a UUID. One example, static var, and then again a whole array of expenses. This is now 7 examples, which might be a little bit less for our line charts. And in order to show the expenses over the last year, I add another static var where I am iterating over the last 12 months, and I generate 10 expenses for each month. Again, this is random data for which day of this month, which category. I also randomly set the title because we mostly only care about the amount. In this case, I'm using different amount. If it's fixed, I use around 200, 2000, and otherwise it's 1 to 500. So that's why our fixed expense is going to be higher than the variable ones. And then I just generate and add this to my expenses array. I found that generating valuable, useful, and more real example data is quite a good idea, because it's really worth it when we work on our charts. We're going to optimize our access and ranges, so it really shows what the data we have is. Now that you have some models and demo data, the next thing I want you to do is actually add a view model. You could directly now use this data in the views, but I want to make this more realistic, and you probably would use a view model, fetching the sales data in this view model and then creating state properties that we then use in the views. Let's create a new group for this, which is view models, and I can create a new Swift file for sales view model. This is a class, sales view model, observable object. You can also use the new observation macro for this. It might be actually a little bit advantageous because then it's more performance optimized. But since this is only available for the newer versions, I'm going to stick with the old one and create a add published var for my sales data. Sales data. This is an array of sales points. In the initializer, or when the view loads, I would fetch the data from server or from an API, depending on what data you want to show. For our previews in our demo app that we are using, I am going to create a static var preview. This is of type sales view model, where I can create a view model example, sales view model. And we can now set here our sales data to the one we that I generated in the examples array. So here you could say either these examples, which were the 10 or 20, or the 3 months examples, and then return this view model. I'm going to add more data here that I also want to set in the preview example. The other good thing about this view model is that I can add here some of my calculations. For example, I can say the total sales over the last 3 months, or the total sales that is in my sales data. I want to calculate this. So I can use here reduce The initial value is 0, and then I'm just going to add up these values. So $0 plus $1, which is the next value's quantity. If you want to do the statistics that I showed of, one of the most important metrics is, did my sales increase or decrease? And for this, I need to know how much it was the last time. For now, let's just use a last total sales, also with at published var, and int. This is another thing I would probably get from my server. And we can set this here to last total sales of 1200. We need to see what data I have, what makes sense. Other things that you can calculate is, for example, I want to know the sales number in a certain week. So we need to do this reduce or sum up all the sales in 1 week. So what I want is the sales by week data. And the type that I'm using here is an array of tuples, and the first value is day, it's the date, the beginning of this week, and then number of sales, which is an integer. I'm creating here 2 different functions. This is a lot of calculations, that's why I'm going to skip over this a little bit faster. So first I'm going to group all the sales per week. So I used the calendar, calculating the start of the week. This is also the date that I'm using here. So I'm appending the sales data to this week that it belongs to. And otherwise, if it doesn't already exist in this array, I create a new entry in this array with the start of the week. So now I have for each date an array of sales, but I want to just know the number in each week. And I use a second function where I take this array of date and sale to an array of tuples. This kind of array of tuples is easy to work with the charts. So for each of my data points in the sales by date, I'm going to take this sales array and sum up all the quantities. And then I add a new tuple entry in this array. Now I can use these 2 functions to first group my sales data per week, and then I calculate the total sales for each of this data that I'm giving here. This is now a computed property, which means that every time something changes, this is going to be calculated a lot. For my test demo, this is sufficient because I want to just quickly test all my charts, and if I set up my data here correctly. The next step, if you want to do this in a production app, would be to create a data flow of every time my sales data changes, I'm going to calculate the sales by week again, and also the total sales. Now I have quite a bit of data to work with and show you some of the things that we can do with charts. So it's finally time to build some views, and I create here a new group for views because I have here different sections. So we have one group for sales stats, one group for weekday stats, book category, and expenses stats. And I'm going to start with the sales data. So we're going to show the sales data over each day, week, and month. New file. So I said I want to have daily sales chart view. Similarly, we test this for the weekly charts view and the monthly chart view. Okay, let's start with the daily one. For all of these charts, I need to import charts. The only thing that this view is going to need is actually the sales data. So this is an array of my sale information, which is then convenient because we prepared this as some examples. Okay, now let's create a chart. I only show here one data, so I'm using the initializer with data and content. The data is my sales data. Sale in, and for each of these sales, I'm going to use a bar mark. And I'm using here X and Y. I don't use any stacking, width or height variations. The plottable value is label and value. So the localized or the title of this value is the day, because I want to show here daily sales. And the value is my sales quantity. For the Y, I'm again using value and label. So this is the sales. This is not quantity, this is day, sales date, and quantity. I'm going to format the preview a little bit. I'm going to add here an aspect ratio of 1. Otherwise, it's just going to stretch it so much. And padding Now you see that I have here this bar charts in a very separated area. This is because it gets a date point and it doesn't know we are talking about a unit of day by day. And you can specify this with the unit argument and tell it, oh, I use your day. And my problem is that my example data is not right. I should have used here 3 months example. And now you get really 1 data point per day. Right now it's really very squished, and we're going to fix this in a bit when we introduce the scrolling behavior. This is only available for iOS 17 and macOS 14 and then all the recent operating systems. Now let's have a look at the other 2 charts we want to create, weekly and monthly, to see how we can change the x-axis to show different time units. I'm going to go on the weekly. This is importing charts with the same sales data of my sales array, and the sales data is sale.3 months example. I might as well simply copy the same chart, and in this case I am using here the week of year, and again for the preview, this aspect ratio. You could also set a fixed frame. And I'm changing here my name to week. The interesting thing is that SwiftCharts automatically here, every time I use the same week in my sales data, there's lots of values with the same week. And SwiftCharts already creates buckets for each or bars for each so that it adds them up in the same bar. I did do these calculations in the view model just now to manually create these buckets for each sales day. There's certain advantages of doing this, and one of them is, for example, if you want to have a foreground style, you could, for example, use here blue, nothing changed, and then add a gradient. And I need to zoom in so you see this properly. You see now it's not one gradient, it's tiny little gradients. This is because for each of my sales data that I added here, it's stacking them on top of each other, and it applies the gradient to each of these sections in each of these bars. Whereas if I do use a different system, let's just create a second one. So this is the example where I use the plain data directly. And instead of this data, I want to use the data that we created in the view model. Because it's the view model, I need to actually have here this view model. Observed object var sales view model. I use observed object because it's probably going to be used in all of the other views. So it's something that we pass around. Then we're going to create 2 previews, one with the plain data and the other one I'm going to use the sales view model preview. Okay, you now have to adapt the chart to use the data that comes from the sales view model that I had here with sales by week, which is a tuple of date and sale. This is not identifiable, so in this case I need to add here ID. And the tuple value that I'm going to use is the day. What I'm getting is here the sales data. For the X, I use the sales data's day. And for the Y, it's the sales data's sales. This is the integer that I calculated. I need to add here something to my previews. And I think I should have used different example data with this 3 months too. Let's use the same data. In this case, because it has one value for each of these bars, this gradient works nicely. If you don't want this gradient, you can just use the simple one and charts will take care of the rest to group them correctly. The other advantage of using your own calculations here is that now I have the data information of the amount of sales per week. This is interesting when I'm going to use here this chart with an interaction, because I need to show here this little overlay of what's the week and what's the sales in this week. Okay, now let's go to the last example for month import charts. I'm going to use again the simpler version of sales data with the 3 months example. So I would use the same chart style. And in this case, I'm going to use the unit of month. So this is month. Adding again this aspect ratio and padding for the preview. Conveniently now, the x-axis gets this values for April, May, June, and July. This is also localized, so if you try another language, it perfectly adapts to. Super convenient the way they made this working with dates. Now that we have this first example for charts, I want to talk about how to style charts a little bit. And we are starting actually by removing the axis information. This is for creating this section for my sales statistics. As you see, it's really just the bars that are shown. And we're going to use the weekly charts data. I'm going to create a new subview for simple book sales view. So in this case, I want to use this weekly charts and we modify it. So I want to use this one, which needs the sales data, which comes from my view model, observed var sales view model. So I just continuously pass this down. Also adding this in my preview. What I want to have is one text and then the charts below, which means I should start with a VStack. Because I used this view on a list, I'm not going to add here padding inside. I'm going to do this in my preview. And I'm going to add a frame height of 100. Okay. Let's just work on the text that goes above. And one thing I need to know is actually if my book sales increased or not. I had in my sales view model here the total sales, the last total sales and my current total sales. So I just want to know the increase here, if it's increased or decreased. And I want to show here the percentage of how much it increased or decreased. You could now move this in the view model or you could move this in here because I'm going to do some text editing. I'm going to leave this here. So first I need to know the percentage. So what I need is the total sales divided by the last total sales minus 1 because I only want to know the changes. Total sales and last total sales are integers and we're working here with percentages. That's why I have to convert to double. Then I need to know if it increased or decreased because I want to show a different text. I use here is positive changed property, just saying if this is larger than 0 or smaller than 0. And now I need to construct a string saying decreased or increased. So this is the changed book sales, returning me an optional string. So we're starting by getting the percentage. Then I need to use here the number formatter and set the style to percentage. This then I can use to format my percentage. I have to first go to an NS number. Then I start to construct my string. Starting here with, if the percentage is lower than 0, I say decreased by, and if it's higher, it's increased, and then I put these both string values together, the decreased by and then the percentage. The reason why I need to work here with optional is because my NS number might fail, the string formatting might fail. Okay, now, above my charts, I can create a text showing this information, and I use a if-let statement. Because if I don't have here a change, I probably don't show anything. Then I start with your book sales, the change text, and then in the last 90 days. The reason I do this with this plus is so I can combine texts with different formatting, like here this bold. So you see this here now coming up. If you want to show a little indicator of going up or down, because this is the main thing for most people, do I make good progress or not so good progress? And for this, again, use here the is positive change. So here I am adding a system image. If the change is positive, I use a up arrow and otherwise down. Again, this is bold. And I should even change the foreground color to green if it's positive and red if it's negative. In this case, it's negative. Now these texts are below each other because they are in the VStack, and I'm adding here a H-stack around everything. This is the default alignment of center, and I want to use first text baseline. Let's zoom in, and now it's here nicely aligned. Maybe you want to have one preview with positive and one preview with negative progress. So we can create here two different previews and giving here a string description. So now I have two previews. Right now they're the same. I can use the preview to change something in my view models. Just check. This is maybe a little bit too much. And I'm changing my normal preview value to 500. This now really depends on what I actually set for my values. Okay, now for the default preview I have an increase of 75%. And for the negative I have a decrease of 10%. The text is now looking good. We can continue working on the chart, I wanted to remove this axis. We have a lot of modifiers for this. If you type chart, we have the chart x-axis visibility hidden. Now the x-axis is gone, and I can use the chart y-axis visibility to hidden. If you want to only change some of this axis, because maybe you want to have the labels here but not this grid, we have another possibility. And I'm going to show you how to customize this with the monthly sales, because here my text is a little bit offset and I actually would like to have this centered. I like the default naming here, and we're going to use the chart x-axis content, not visibility. And here you can say axis marks, preset position values. So preset position is if you want to have it below or above. And you can also say which values you want to have. I'm just going to use the default one for now. And for example, if you want to have the axis grid lines, this is this grid. If you want to now add the labels, we use the axis value labels. If you don't specify anything here, just add them, then it uses the one we had before. There is also additional changes, and one of them here is with format. So this is daytime and then month, and you can even say which format. For example, narrow, or this is maybe a little bit too short. And you saw there was also some other things like centered, true, and now it's in the middle. Okay, maybe in this case, I'm just going to remove the grid lines, because especially with bars, you probably don't need them. You can test the other axis properties like top, and now the labels are on the top. But in my case, it's fine with the lower one. You can do the same with the y-axis content. So this is axis mark. And now you can, for example, use the value ones. Value, position value. Let's say I want to change this to leading. And for example, you can specify here also exact values that you want to have. Again, I use here axis label, this default one. Now it uses only the ones that I specified here. I use the axis grid lines. For example, here with the stroke style, where you can specify the emitter. So this is the dash faces. So this is really, let's say you want to have dash of 10 and 20. And this actually has to go in the axis markers. Axis ticks. This is now here, this tick. You can specify how many you want to have or which distance you want to have using here fixed axis. So everything works over this chart y-axis modifiers. I'm just going to stick with the default ones. There's going to be more examples for customizing the axis later. But I hope this gives you some idea what you can actually do and how flexible it is. Now that I have here my 4 different charts implemented, I actually want to build the UI, so this first section. So starting with the navigation stack, this first view with these lists, and then going to the detail with this picker where you can move between these different chart types. Okay, first I go in my content view, and I have data that I need to use and share between these different views, which is my state object var sales view model, of type sales view model. And just for this demo, I'm also using here the preview data. I would definitely want to exchange this for the real one later. Then the main content here is going to change, and I use a navigation stack with a root. This is a list, and I have here a navigation link with destination and label. So the destination is the detail where I switch between this daily, weekly, and monthly, which I actually didn't create here. So let's create a new file, detail book sales view. This is using all the charts with the data, so I definitely also need to pass downwards this information with the view model, similar to what I have here. In the preview, I use the preview one. We're going to do this in a minute. I just want to set things up. So my destination is my detail book sales view with this sales view model. And the label is this simple book sales view here, which also needs this data. Okay, this is looking like the section I wanted. we're going to add a navigation title of your bookstore stats. If I tap on this, I go to the detail, which we didn't build yet. This is also a good moment to evaluate if my chart is a good preview, if the information is there. And maybe I would probably make a little bit smaller. So I'm going to change the frame height to 70. Need to check this later on when we have all the other sections. Okay, now let's go to the detail view. And I wanted to toggle here between the 3 different chart types, which means I need a picker, which means I need to have an enum for the selection. This enum type I'm defining in my view because I only need this type anyway in the view. So it makes sense to be a part of the namespace of this view. Time interval, string, case iteratable, because it's the picker, it's easier to create the picker, identifiable. Case number 1 was we want to show this by day and the string value is day. Case number 2 is week with a week string. And case number 3 is month with the string month. And the ID is again of type self, so time interval, and we're just returning a self. Okay, now I have a type that I can use here as a state for my picker. Add state private var selected time interval, and we start with day. Okay, now for my view, I start with a VStack, and I can here generate a picker with selection, content, and label. So the selection, this is what I created here, this state property for. Selected time interval. The content is now I need to give all the options that we had, which is for each. I use the time intervals all cases. This is because I add here case iteratable, which is in returning me now an array of all my cases. Interval in, and I show here a text with the intervals row value. So this is either day, week, or month. And as the label, I say time interval for chart. Per default on iOS, it uses a menu picker style, and I rather want to have a picker style of segmented. Okay, adding here a little bit of padding. Now that I have here a selected time interval, we can use this to decide which of my charts I'm going to show. So this is switch case. In case we are daily, I show my daily chart view with the sales data, so which is in the view model sales data. Otherwise, I use the weekly chart view with the sales view model, and the last for month case, it's the monthly chart view with the sales view models sales data. If I now switch between these tabs, I can switch between those views. This aspect ratio I don't really like, so I'm going to add here aspect ratio of 0.9, 0.8, and a spacer to move everything up. I can't directly add aspect ratio to my switch case, and I don't want to add them individually, so I'm embedding everything in a group, which then passes all the view modifiers down to the individual views. Okay, now I can nicely switch here. Maybe I should change back to my axis on the other side, just for consistency. Okay, let's just remove the y-axis here one. Go back to the detail. If you want to have this with a little bit more animation, you can add the animation modifier to this property. And now it nicer does the animations, the fade in and fade out. The reason why it's not like you animating the bars inside is because I'm switching here between 3 different charts. Then, similar to my simple view where I had here the summary, we can also add another text above, or the key takeaways. For example, I can say you sold, giving the total sales in bold with the accent foreground color, that's why it's in blue, which is nicely working with the chart, which is also using the accent color. And then in the last 90 days. You could also change this depending on which of the selections you have. Next, I want to make my charts a little bit more interactive. And for the daily chart view, because I have so much data squished, I would prefer to use here the scrolling. And when I scroll, I also want to show a little text to give the time range we are looking at right now. You could also use this to calculate something. For example, in this case, it's like how much did you sell in this time range of books. So we have now a look at implementing scrollable charts. This is a newer feature available for iOS 17 and macOS 14. I go in my daily chart view and we're going to change this to become scrollable with the chart scrollable axis of horizontal. And now it starts to scroll. There's a couple of interesting things. I need to actually go and change to see the initial one. First, it picks a certain time range, which we might want to change. Initial scroll position is at the beginning of this time frame. So this is for me the beginning of this 90 days, but I would actually want to show the latest. So I want to scroll to the last positions here, to this last range. Let's start by discussing how to set the length of this visible area. And in my case, I'm just starting by defining a property for number of display days to set this to 30. Then I'm going to use the chart X visible domain length. So this is apparently in seconds. If I just use my number here is days, so how many seconds is a day? First we have 3,600 seconds in an hour, then we have 24 hours per day, and then we have multiply this by number of display days, so now we should be by 30 days. The next thing that you can do is when you scroll here, you can also use the newer snapping behavior of scroll views. For example, you could say that to snap in at the beginning of the week. So this is chart scroll target behavior of paging value aligned limit init with hour of 0. And the major alignment is matching init for day. So now when you scroll, it scrolls and you let it go. It scrolls to the beginning of the day. You can try to scroll to a position where it's half over one of these bars. And you see it moves to the offset. Start again, try to hide parts of this, and now snaps to the next one. Now the next thing I want to do is changing the scroll position, the initial one. We can use the chart scroll position modifier for the x-axis, because I said I scroll in horizontal direction. This needs a binding to a plottable value, and I'm creating here a state property at state private var scroll position of type time interval type, and I'm going to use this here, which obviously doesn't work because this time interval is outside, and I need to properly set this, not just to this random value, which I'm doing in the initializer, because here I have my sales data and I can calculate the proper scroll position. Starting with the sales data's last value, this is sorted by creation date or sales date. I'm taking this sales data, so now I have the end value, but the scroll offset position is the beginning. So now I need to go back 30 days, and I use here the adding time interval going in minus direction. I need to go earlier than the last day. And this is again this 30 days. Now I have a value that I can override my scroll position, because this is state. I need to use underbar scroll position and create a state with an initial value of my beginning time interval, and I use here the time interval since reference date, and we're back on track properly. And if you try to scroll now, you see it doesn't go any further because we went to the first position. So this is in the last 30 days of my time reference, this is the date I'm looking for. Now if I want to show the time frame that we're currently showing in the text above, we need to do some formatting and use the scroll position, because this is also keeping track on if I change it. And it's actually, the scroll position is the beginning of this time area that I show here. So it's this one here is the scroll position. It is a time interval. If you want to have a date type, we can create a computed property, for example, scroll position start date. I use the date with an initializer of time interval since reference date. Then I can also use the end date, again with adding intervals, similar to what I did here, where I went 30 days back. I do the other way around. Now I add 30 days. So this would be then starting with the scroll position start date and then adding 30 days. Then if I want to format this, I can use these two dates to format them in a certain way, for example, date, time, month, and day. And this, the end one I use year. So I'm adding here VStack. And above I show a text with the scroll position string and the scroll position end string. As you see now, it shows from the 25th to the 25th. And if I move, this is updating. Here now it shows the 30th. This is a little bit tricky because, for example, here the 7th of May, this is this dash line. So this peak is the 7th and this is the 8th. And if I move here, then this line is now the 8th and shown up here. If you want to do a little bit of styling, we can do alignment of leading. And I don't want to have this text so prominent, so make this a font of caption, and the foreground color or foreground style as it is now to secondary, so it becomes gray. Okay, let's see this together. In my content view, I go to my detail. I have here now these 3 sections. The top area is so big because the navigation, title, display mode, inline. Now it's smaller. Okay, now if I go to the day area, I can now scroll here. Maybe we change this one also to leading. So in my detail book sales view, I use a VStack with an alignment of leading. Okay, this is now the first example for interaction, which is scrolling. And the next one I want to do is allowing the user here to select one of these weeks. I'm now in the weekly charts view where I want to add this interaction to select. So the first thing is I need to have a state property that gives me the selected date, or let's call this raw selected date. This is date optional nil, and we can use a chart modifier for chart X selection for range and value. And I'm using here the value one, where I have to give a binding to my raw selected date. Now the first thing I want to actually do is show here a line at the position of my selected date. And this line we are going to use a rule marker inside this chart because I have here then more than just this sales data. I'm moving this in by adding here a for each, and now after my for each with the main data I can check if I have a raw selected date. Then I can show a rule mark at the X position with value and label. This is the selected date and the value is the raw selected date and the unit is week of year. So now if you move over, you see this bar is moving and it's always in the center of each of these weeks. Let's test this for day. In this case you get the day information. And if you move over, you see move in this week. So it's automatically moving to the right position. I'm going to keep it like this because it highlights better what's going to come up in a minute. I'm just going to change here the foreground color. Foreground style to color.gray.opacity to make it a little bit more subtle. This is now on top of these bars and I want to have it behind it. So I use a z-index of -1. Now it's behind. The next thing I wanted to do is add an annotation. So this is a small card that says me the date of this week that we are selected and the number of sales in that week. For this we can use an annotation modifier with possibilities to decide for the position, alignment and spacing. So I'm maybe going to use the position, spacing, overflow, resolution and content. Oh my god, there's too many options sometimes. So let's just set something as top, 0 spacing, overflow resolution with X as fit to chart and Y disabled. And now I can actually add the content and my view here gets already a little bit nested. So I'm going to add this below, creating a view builder property var selection pop over some view VStack. I start with, actually, because my selection here is optional, if I don't have anything selected. I don't want to show anything. So I'm starting with if select raw selected date. And then I start to create here my view. So for example, we can say raw selected date formatted. And I'm just going to use this selection pop over for now. So now if you tap here, I get this line and this text. I'm currently only getting the time frame, but the main thing was the sales in this week. So we need to do some calculations for this. And what I need is the day, the beginning day of this week, and the sales in this week. So this is an integer. So what I want is a selected date value. I use again a tuple date, and the other one is sales, which is an integer. This is optional because if I don't have anything here selected, then I can't return anything. So if let raw selected date, if I have something and else I return here null. Okay, let's calculate this. I need to check my view model. So my sales view models, sales by week. This is already organized by week, and I want to have the first one where. And now we need to calculate here this time interval. In the sales by week array, the sales or the date value there is the beginning of the week. This is the start of week is $0.day, and the end of week. In order to do this, I'm using here the calendar from the environment. Okay, so the calendar, I'm telling it to do a date manipulation by adding days of 6 to the start of week. This is optional, so I'm just returning here this date, and then I return here true or false in this check if the range of start of week to end of week contains my raw selected date. Okay, I have now the selected date value with the day and sales, which I want to use here for my annotation. So I can just use the selected date values because everything is in there. The selected date value had the day, and the selected date value had the sales. Okay, try again. Now I have here the sales. I don't need to have here the whole hour or two. So we are going for formatted daytime, month, and day. If I now select this, it's just showing the month and the day. And I'm going to add here a little bit of background and padding. You won't see this here. This is because I'm going on this view. If for week, you see I added this background so it overlays what is behind. I could also use this property to hide here the top part. And the other thing that I also want to do is I want to gray out or make the other weeks more opaque if something is selected. So we add here another modification to make each of these bars more opaque, depending if my selected date values day is nil. So if nothing is selected, all of them should be blue. Or if my selected date value day is equal to the value that I have here for the sales data, stay. If this is true, then I use 1, and otherwise I use more opaque 0.5. Now I need to find out if it is correct. Going in the preview where I actually added this. So now when I move over here, the one that is selected has an opacity of 1, and the other ones have 0.5. In case nothing's selected, this is this condition, then all of them are using the 1 opacity. Now that we have some stuff, you can also play around with these positions. For example, you can move to bottom, which would add it on the lower part of this chart. Or leading, for example, top, trailing. Then spacing, now it's a little bit higher than the chart. Overflow resolution is what happens when there's not enough space. Instead of using this ruler and annotation, we could have also added here text below this chart. Maybe you want to show here a little table with more details. Okay, this was the first part where we worked on this book sales area. Next, I want to work on the statistics for how many sales per weekday and each day of the week we have, and to find out which is the best selling week of the day or the highest selling day of the week. So So this is this section we're going to work on. And first I actually need to extract this kind of information from my data to collect the data depending on which week they are, and then average of all the data points. And in my sales view model, I have this sales data that we have to now use to generate this other data. So what I want to have is the average sales by weekday. Now the question, what kind of data we're using, and I am going to use here an array of tuples. And the first one is the number. This is actually the weekday. Calendar has the option that you can extract the weekday, and it gives you 0 to 6 for each weekday. So this is the first value of this tuple, and the second one is actually the sales numbers. This is in this case a double because I say I'm averaging here, so it's not a total number int. And right now I'm just going to return here an empty one, because the other thing, in order to average over something, we need to first take our sales points and generate a sales by weekday. So in this case, I am again using this again using here a tuple for number weekday, and then the full sales, which are my sales data points. So this is a array of all the sales that were conducted on this weekday. Return. Both of these are computed properties. This is currently for testing of my algorithms. Probably would just calculate them once and set them to one of the state properties. Okay, to do this sales by weekday, I am going to create first a function, sales group by weekday, for sales, taking the sales array, and I'm returning here a dictionary. For each key is the weekday, the integer, and the value is the sales that were conducted on this weekday. So I need to iterate over this array, and I'm going to store the values in sales by weekday, same type as result. This is going to be also the returned value, sales by weekday. Then I need to figure out which day of the week these sales were done, and I'm going to use the calendar. Then I need to create a for each loop to iterate over all my sales data to figure out which weekday it was. So I use the calendar's component to extract the weekday for each of the sales dates. This is the value, this is an integer, 0 to 6. Then if this dictionary does not have this weekday yet, I'm creating a new entry. And otherwise, for this weekday, I'm going to append a new sales value. Okay, now I can use this sales by weekday, because I said I'm returning from this function a dictionary, and I want to have here a tuple. I need to convert this first with map. So here I create a tuple from the key and the value. This is not sorted. Dictionaries are not sorted. So I'm returning here sales by weekday sorted by the number. Okay, now I have this array and I want to create the average sales by week. So I need to average over all the sales values. Again, I'm going to create another function. I like to have this function because later if you want to create data streams to update to calculate this only once, then functions is easier, and also functions are good for testing if you want to write unit tests. So first I need to take this number sales array and create a collection. So down here I create a new function that takes this type, this data that we just created, and returns an easier to digest something that I can show my graphs with the number, that is the weekday and the sales data. I start by creating an empty results array that I'm returning here, average sales, and then I need to iterate over this dictionary where I get the number and the sales array. I first get the count, then I sum up over all my sales quantities. Then I append a new value with the weekday and the average value. So the total number by the number of values we had here. And now I can finally calculate this. So starting by getting the sales by weekday. In this case, I first get the sales data, then I calculate the average, and then I do again the sorting. Okay, now, and the last one is the highest selling weekday, since I have now the average. So I would take this array and find the maximum sales day. So I'm just using here a max by the sales value. This is optional because maximum, maybe there is nothing in this array. Finally, I have some data now. There's a lot of array operations involved in this and handling dates. But I wanted to use real data to actually show how to do this whole process. Now I am going to work on the weekday views. So create a new file, SwiftUI view, a sales by week, a day. And then I'm going to create for the list preview a simple version of this. So this is the simple sales by week day view. Okay, let's start with the simple one. This is very similar to what we did before. You can also test this yourself if you want to. I have here importing charts, and we are working again with the data that come from the observed object var the sales view model of type sales view model. And then in the preview I use this data. Okay, I start with a VStack because I still need to have this one sentence with the key takeaway. And the main thing was to say your highest selling day of the week. This is in my sales view model. If let highest selling day, weekday. So if I have something that I can show you, I again use this text addition to get this nice highlighting. Then the text using the highest selling weekday, the number, this is number 2, and this is not really what I want to have the name of the weekday. So we can use the date formatter to create a weekday for number int that returns here a string to say formatter. And then formatter has lots of functions like weekday symbol, so this is the whole array. And then we can choose the number, and this array is the number that we have. So for example, there is the short weekday symbol for this number, -1 actually, which I then can use here. Weekday for this, and it's Friday. And this is a little bit too short, so we just use the weekday symbols. So now it says Wednesday, which is much nicer. Then I can add here bold and foreground style of color.accent color. Now I use the highest selling day sales number, sales per day. And I think I need to use here somewhere an empty space. Okay, now we have the header. And I can actually work on the chart. So in this case, I'm only showing one type of data. This is a tuple. So I use data with ID. This is my sales view models average sales by weekday. The ID is the number. This is the weekday. And I show a bar mark, X and Y. Value is weekday. And the weekdays number. And for Y, this is the average sales. And the value is the weekdays sales. Now it doesn't know that we are talking about days. I'm going to add here padding in the preview and a fixed frame height of 70 again. Okay, now there's a couple of things to fix this. And the first one is if you have numbers, you always get these distinct levels. And instead of these numbers, I'm going to use now the weekday 2, weekday for number. And now I have issues with my naming. I'm just going to leave this, and we're just calling here $0.number and $0.sales. Now you see this down here, but at least the axes are correct, and I can use again the chart x-axis visibility hidden and the chart y visibility hidden. This is also easier now. With this width, for example, you can say ratio of 0.1. So now they are much narrower. 5, they would use half their space, and 0.9. So now they are much closer together. Maybe we stick with 8. And I can do some adjustments like the alignment of leading. Then I want to highlight the highest selling one, this one, with an opacity of if $0's number is equal to the sales view models highest selling weekdays number. Then I use opacity of 1, otherwise 0.5 to make it more opaque. So this one is now sticking out. You can also use foreground color styles of color.accent and add here a gradient to make it look a little bit nicer. But the good thing is, because this one is the same color as my Saturday, it's more clear that this is Saturday. I'm going to extract this part because I use the same text in this detail view here. This is subview of sales by weekday header view. So what I need is again this view model and then this whole part with the formatting again. Adding my sales data in the preview. This I can then use here, the sales header view. Okay, I'm copying all this into the next view, importing charts the same as before as the starting point. Again, the preview data. Okay, in this case, I'm not doing here this frames setting. I use an aspect ratio of 1 with content mode fit and a padding around everything. Now in this case, as you see here, my names are too long, and instead of the weekday symbol I use the short weekday symbol. Now it's Sunday to Saturday. In order to highlight you, one thing you should pay attention to is if you go for very short weekday symbol, you only have 5 SMT, V and W and F, and you already see here that there are some steps. This is because I have 2 times a value with T. This is how I identify them here in my chart, which means that the chart is going to draw them together for Tuesday and Thursday, same for Saturday and Sunday. So this is a little bit of a short weekday symbol. This is working because now they're all distinguishable. I want to now work a little bit on the formatting. So we're going to add all these different kinds of chart styles, starting with changing the styling here. And I thought it would be nice to add this little marker on the top part. So we're going to use rectangle marks for this. So we have to change this to gray, starting with gray. I don't do the opacity of the highest selling number right now. Just gray, and the opacity becomes 0.3. And we're adding a little rectangle line on top with a rectangle mark. And in this case, you can say X, Y, width and height. This is actually the same values here, with the only difference that I'm setting a height of 1. As you see, I have here this little blue markers. And again, I use here the color gray. Maybe we do 3 to highlight the top parts. Now I want to show the medium values for all of these sales data. So first I add a function that actually takes my sales data and it gives me the average sale, the medium value. And this function I use for another computed property, which is the median sales. You can also do some easier calculations. So now in my sales by weekday view, I can show a rule mark, and I only care about Y. This is the value median sales with the sales models medium sales, and this needs to be inside the chart. This is one problem because I have here I'm reiterating about all values. I don't want to right now I'm creating this ruler for each of them, and that's not what I want. This is in a for each. So for each of my sales per weekday, I create a bar mark and a rectangle and then one ruler. If you want to show then with a scatter plot, for example, the sales data for these individual days, for each of my sales by weekday with the ID of number. This is the weekday data. This now has the array of sales in there, and I need to iterate over them. So I need to have here another for each of my individual data points. Sale in. I use a point mark. For the day, I use the series weekdays number. This is to get the weekday, and the sales data is the quantity. This is a little bit boring because I used here just really random stuff. So I wrote another property that generates me more elements, so 300. And in this case, it's using a Gaussian distribution around these values. And here you see the average. So we have The 7th, which is Saturday, has an average of 60. Let's use these in the preview view model. Going to my sales. And now I have here a little bit more interesting data because my dots are around this average value. So I see a lot of blue dots. In order to see more where are more, I'm going to use the opacity to 0.3. So now you get a little bit better idea of how many sales were actually in this range. I'm not sure how many people actually care about this kind of graphs, because now my data is so much that people are probably going to struggle. So what I want to do is add here a couple of toggles that show and hide this additional information. First, I create state properties at state private var median sales is shown, and this is true. At state private var video sales days are shown, false. Now let's create this toggle below the graph, this chart. So here, let's just collapse this. So down here I add a toggle. Title key is on. This is for individuals are shown. Then I show all daily sales binding to this individual sales shown data, and then another toggle for the median. Again, I need to check. The other one is for median sales shown. If this is true, I'm saying show median sales. And if it's false, hide median sales. And I am using here the median sales property to bind. Okay, now that I have these toggles, I actually need to update my UI depending on it. One was this ruler. If show medium is shown, only then I'm showing this ruler. And if individuals are shown, then I show all this scatter plot. Now if you toggle this, it shows and hides. If you want to do this with an animation, you can add here to this toggle bindings dot animation, and now all changes are done with an animation. So now they fade in and out. You also see that the chart's axis actually adapt. If you don't like this, you can also set a manual axis range. What I also wanted to do, before I forget it, is actually adding an annotation to this ruler with the actual value. So here it's an annotation with medium string value for this median value, which I get from my sales ruler, this medium sales. Now it's also shown and hidden. And since I would like to change the position of this, I use the other argument position of trailing, and then alignment of top, a position of top, and the alignment of trailing. Okay, yeah, I did it exactly the other way around. The position is in regards to the ruler that I'm add this annotation to. So on top of this ruler, I'm adding this with an alignment of trailing. If you want, you can also add here different colors. For example, now my Saturday is actually here blue. You could change the foreground style to indigo for this text and the ruler. Then it is more clear that I don't mean Saturday with this value here. Okay, now that I have my views together, I want to just add them to my content view. So I add navigation link with destination and label. The destination is my sales by weekday view with the sales view model. And the label is the simple sales by weekday view with the sales view model. Now it creates one section with them both. And I don't like this. I want to have a little bit more spacing, so I'm adding a section around each of them. Then when I go to the detail, I have here this view. Let's just also add the navigation inline and add a spacer so it's moving higher. So down here, after all my toggles, I add a spacer. So now we have these two views, and this view is quite interesting because I added different kind of interaction of showing and hiding additional information. If you want, for example, if people don't understand what you mean here, you can also add now a description when they show this to say, okay, look at this behavior to understand if it's valuable or not. So you can always add here more information below, or change also the title description. Next, I want to build the section where we compare different book categories with each other to find out which is the highest selling one. So for this, I'm going to use these pie charts or donut charts. So we're going to build this and then the detail view and more informations with this larger donut chart. Similar, I can use the same data with sales per category, book category, also with a bar chart. And in this case, we are showing here this bar chart in this vertical stack, adding here a little bit more information with these annotations. The other thing I wanted to demonstrate with these kind of charts is how the chart changes when I change my data. So we're going to also implement here this refresh button and see how we can animate changes. Okay, now let's go into code. And in order to show this, I actually need to prepare my data to get the sales for each category. I need to use my sales data again. That's why I also do this in the view model, creating here nice separate functions that you could use for testing. So I need to calculate the sales group by category. This is similar to what I did here, group by weekday. Yes, I'm just going to add this here. Maybe with, you can also add markers as soon as it's getting too long, of category stats. I'm creating here a function sales group by categories that takes the sales data and it returns me a dictionary for each book category. This is the key of this dictionary. It gives me an array of the sales that are in this category. Starting with a sales by category empty array that I am also going to return here. And now I'm going to iterate over my sales to add all the sales category data here. So for each of the sales, I check the books category. If I already have one entry in my dictionary for this category, then I'm just going to append this sales to this category sales array. And otherwise, I'm adding a new value in this dictionary. This is the first step for calculating the sales per category, but I don't want to have here an array of sales. I just want to have the number of books sold in this category. And for this, I'm writing another function, total sales per category, where I take exactly the input from this function and then return here a tuple or array of tuples. This is because the chart works just much better with this. Also, an array of tuples is ordered, whereas a dictionary is not ordered. You need to have a random access collection, something with structure. In this case, my return is for each, it gives me the category and the sales for this category. Again, what I want to return is an array of tuples. Return, and I have to iterate over all my sales by category data. And for each of these entries, I am taking the sales array and just adding up all the quantities of these books. So this gives me an integer, the number, the total quantity for this category. And then I can append a new tuple value to my results array. Okay, now this is now the two functions that I have. And I am, similar to before, just going to add here computed property for now, which is total sales per category. This is the return value that you just saw in this function, an array of tuples. I use my first function to group all the sales data by category, and then I use the second function to flatten this to get the sales number. And then the last step is I'm going to sort this by the number of sales so that the first entry in this array is the one with the highest number. This is then giving me the data that I can use to show these charts. What is still missing is I want to say here what is the most sold category, or the best-selling category, so I need to know which one is the maximum here. And I'm just going to add another computed property where I go through this total sales per category here, and I'm looking for the maximum value, which is the highest sales value. Now we have the data prepared and we can actually create these charts. Now I'm going to add a couple of files in the book category stats group. These are all SwiftUI views, starting with the sales per book category pie chart view. The next one is for these bar charts. So this is a sales per category bar chart view. Then I'm going to add one file where I want to basically just a detail view where I can toggle between these different statistics. So I'm just going to call this sales per book category view. And then I want to show the first view and the simple one in the main list or the preview one. New file, simple sales per book category view. And we're starting with the simple one. Again, I need to import here charts. Then I have to have access to the data that we are showing, which is in this view model. So add observed var sales view model is of type sales view model. In my preview, I use the one that we generated with preview, starting with an H stack, because I want to have here text and the chart. Okay, so I'm going to first generate this text header, this text saying which is the highest selling category and the percentage of the sales. Because this is a text I'm using also in the detail view, I'm again creating another new file, SwiftUI view. This is a sales per book category header view. I need my observed object var sales view model because in there is the categories that we just talked about. Sales view model, and then the preview. What I want to say is here your best selling category is plus, and now I need to access the sales view models best selling category. This is optional because of this array operation. I'm going to start with if let sales view models best selling category. Only if I have something, then I'm showing this. So I don't need to do this optional heading in the text. The categories display name, making this bold. And foreground style of color.accent color plus, and then text with, and then I want to show the percentage, which is the best-selling, which is in the best-selling category here. I need to actually calculate something, so I'm adding here a function in this view. So this is the best-selling category percentage string. So this is again, I use here my sales view models best selling category. Then I am using the sales number and dividing it by the total sales. I need to do this percentage formatting, which means I'm using here a number formatter with a percent style. And then I can use this to say, convert this to a string percentage, and then it returns here this formatted percentage, and I can use this now as in my text. I don't show anything, so now it shows here 43%, and you can also add more text plus text of all sales. Your best-selling category is fiction with 47% of all sales. Okay, let's now use this header view in my simple view first, giving it a sales view model. And we can now here add this chart with the data and ID. I'm using the sales view models total sales per category with the ID of category. Data in this chart, I have to use one of these mark query types, and in order to create pie charts or donut charts, you have to use the new section mark. In this case, because I am here having a circle, I'm not having X and Y, it's just one value, which is the angle. Plottable value, otherwise it's the same with value and label. So this is the book category, and the value is the data's sales. As you see, you don't see a lot. This is because it's using for all of these sections the same color, and there's no spacing between them. You don't actually see. So let's fix this and change this with the angular inset of 1. Angular inset means that it's now adding a little bit of spacing between each of them. Let's make it 1.5. Then, because now it's a pie chart, but you saw I used a donut chart. And for this, we can use the inner radius with a mark dimension. This is similar. For example, this is the one we had before. Sometimes they don't really make sense, but in this case, the ratio is really good. For example, you can say 0.5. So it sets the width of this donut here to half of the radius. You can also try to set this to 25%. The inner radius is now set to 25%. So if I set this to 75%, the donut itself is only 25%. You can use the golden ratio with 0.618. Now I am going to add here in the preview a padding, and we work on the formatting more. It's clearly too big, so around my chart I'm adding a frame of height 70. The layout looks maybe a little bit strange. I'm just going to go in the layout preview. If you highlight tab here somewhere around it, you see the borders of this chart, and it's pretty much taking a little bit more than half of the space. This is because when the layout starts, it gives each of these views a suggestion of half of the space, equal distribution. The text uses a little bit less because it's only trying to fit itself, and the rest goes to the pie chart. The chart itself takes up this whole space because this is stretch to the available space, but the chart's content is inside and only takes a smaller space. I can fix this by saying aspect ratio of 1, content mode to fit. And now the chart only takes up the space it actually needs. Then with this kind of charts, you can also use standard view modifiers like corner radius of 5. So now it's a little bit more smooth with nice corner radius around each of the section. You can also add corner radius to a bar chart. We are nearly done. One of the main things I still need to fix is that I want to highlight which of the sections is this fiction category. And for this, we are using the opacity. So if my sales view model's best-selling category is equal to the category that I have here in this section, then I want to have opacity 1, so bright blue, and otherwise I want to dim it to set it to 0. The best-selling category's category is equal to my data points category. And now this section, the largest section, is blue, which is the same color as here my fiction text. This is a very simple chart view. Now let's go and create the more complex chart where I also use here different colors and adding this legend. So as a starting point, I'm going to copy all of these into my sales per category pie chart view. Starting with importing charts, I place everything in there. And I'm adding my preview data. So I'm not going to show here this header. I'm only concentrating now on this chart. I'm taking out the frame, and in the preview I add here padding. Now I want to add here different colors to the sections. So with this foreground style, there is one where we can say foreground style by plottable value. This is how do you want to distinguish this foreground style. So this is category. And the value that is supposed to use is the data, and this for each the category. And I actually want to use the display name. This now changes the color of each of the section, and now it also has information of each of the section names. Because previously, when you look here, it only knows the value for each section. It doesn't know what it. I did not use this category name so far. Now that we have this legend, I can also change the visibility to hidden, for example, if you don't want to see this. I can change the position. I can change the content. Let's try the position. For example, if you want to have it in the top or leading. In our case, the bottom one was probably already informative enough. And then the spacing parameter, maybe you want to have a little bit more spacing between your chart and the legend. I think this is probably looking better, not so squeezed. The advantage of using a pie chart, it's a donut chart now, is that we have now space to display text in the middle of this chart. And when you want to display this, you can use the chart background, where you get the proxy, chart proxy. This is the coordinates that you have. In order to see this in useful coordinates, I need to use geometry reader. Content, so I have the geometry proxy, and the frame is the geometry chart proxy plot frame. I'm going to force unwrap the plot frame because this is supposed to be called properly. So I'm just going to here show the frame's width, which says it's 361 points. I want to have the center position of my pie chart. So I want to have the mid X and mid Y positions. For example, now my text is in the top leading corner and I want to change the position to the center of my chart. And we can use the position modifier with X and Y, giving here the frames mid X and mid frames mid Y. So it's nicely in the center. With this kind of style, you need to be careful that you don't make it too big. I can see now it's hidden partially by the chart. But since you have the information of how large this area is, you can also add frames to make sure it fits. For example, I can set a maximum width for the frames width divided by, what did I say? I used an inner radius of 0.6, so this is the one. And then for the maximum height, I use the frames height multiplied by the inner radius ratio. So now let's see if this is working. Okay, I added here a black border around this text. Maybe I'm just going to make this more dominant so you actually see. I am for now changing the opacity so we can see the area. So this is the area that I restricted it to now. What I want to have is the frame. It is only this inner circle. And in this case, I use the plot area, which goes in the horizontal direction. It's larger. And it also counts these areas, but I really want to just use the smaller area. And instead of using here both width and height, I'm going to use the minimum of them. So this is the visible size. And I'm going to use the minimum of the frames width and height. Both here my height and width restrictions. And now it uses the correct area. This scales nicely and you can test this. For example, if you add here a larger padding, now the chart becomes smaller, but our text still fits in and doesn't touch the area, the sides. This is good, and I can go back to the opacity of 1 for my largest section. Okay, let's take out the 50 padding and the border width, and I can now finally replace my dummy text here. What I want to use is again here my best-selling category actually. So this is the information I want to show. Again, it's optional, and in this case maybe I'm even going to say if let best-selling category coming from my view model. Only if I have something, I'm going to show this here. So I have a VStack with the most sold category text. Then I show the category's display name in title font, bold, primary, so it makes it black in this case. You can test you can also see how this looks in dark mode. Then it's the number of units sold formatted with a less dominant foreground style. I'm going to take out the dark mode again. Okay, this was the sales categories as a pie chart. And now we're going to use the same data to use a bar chart. The advantage of a bar chart is that I can really show the exact numbers and compare the exact numbers. This donut chart here is good to compare and see what's the highest, to compare different categories to each other and see more the percentage. But for example, if I try to start comparing here the other categories with each other, this chart is not the best. Let's use the same data. This was the charts model. Go on the sales bar, chart view, import, charts, and then with the preview data. Okay, instead of this section mark, I want to use a bar mark with X and Y. And we had book category and the data's categories display name. And for Y value, this was sales and the data's sales number. So I don't need to use this. Adding a padding in the preview. And again, for this whole chart, I use an aspect ratio of 1 with a content mode of fit. I don't actually want to use here legend, so I use the chart legend visibility to hidden. This still leaves me with the problem that my category names are just too long to fit on the x-axis. An easy way of getting a layout that can show longer category titles is to switch the x and y axis. So here, these values, I'm just going to turn around. X, I'm going to use the sales number. And for Y, I use the book categories. This is now placing them nicely next to these charts. And all of my titles fit. And we can add here an annotation to say how much the exact numbers are. For example, I can add here an annotation to each of my bars. Let's even use the one with position and alignment. I use a trailing position and a leading alignment. And for the content, I want to show the text giving the sales numbers. So now they're nicely displayed here. If you want to show them inside this bar, I would have used here the position of overlay. Now it's on the leading edge because I said so, or you can set it to the trailing one. I think there's also a spacing. So now it doesn't push it to the edge, maybe even 20. But I guess in this case, I prefer the earlier version. And similar to changing the opacity of this bar chart, I also want to adapt for this text. So this kind of opacity, I'm also adding for the text. Okay, now that I have these two different chart types for bar chart and this pie charts, I can actually build here my detail view with a picker. And we can add this to the content view. So let's just quickly connect these views. I first need to pass here my observable object var sales view model, which is a sales view model, and the preview is the same date. Then in my content view, I add another section, and in this case, I use the simp sales per book category view, and the detail is my sales per category view. Okay, we have the section, and if I go to the detail, is the view that I did not set up yet. So let's go there. And I want to have this picker to switch between these different views. So we need to first have a state property and an enum type. I'm declaring this in this view because it's view related. So adding inside it here, this namespace is good to keep things organized. Chart style, case iteratable, and identifiable because I use this with the pickers. This is case pie, var ID is of type self, and I return here self. Again, I create a computed property display name, string switch self to return here pie chart or bar chart. Okay, now I have something that I can use for my state property. Add state private var chart type. This is of my chart type, and then initially I'm going to probably show the pie chart. Now for the main content, I am starting with a vstack because I need to show some text, the toggle, and this chart. So the toggle, or the actually it's a picker chart type binding to my selected chart type, and the content, the options I'm showing here in for each of my chart styles, all cases, and I show in the text the chart type's display name. This I want to see in a segmented picker, adding here some padding. Okay, then I can again use the sales per book category header view, and the main point was to show this chart, so I use this chart style here to decide, and we are using a switch case. In case the user select pie chart, I want to use my sales per category pie chart view, passing the sales view model, and in case the user selected bar chart, I use the sales per book category bar chart view, passing again the sales view model. Okay, now let's try switching. Maybe I even with an animation to make this slightly smoother, and I probably want to have a little bit more spacing here. So this is I use the alignment also to leading and the spacing to 20. Here the spacer, so it moves it up. And we can go back to the content view to check these views. This is looking very good. Now that I built the views, the last thing, or one of the main things I wanted to show with this is how to dynamically change the data. So, and for this we need to just check what data I actually have to change. This pie charts using the sales view model, and they're using this total sales per category, which uses the sales data. So everything depends on this array. In my preview, I simply here use the highest weekend 3 months example. Just go there. So I need to, when I want to refresh the data, I need to change that data. This is a static var that I only calculated once, but I also here added this 3 months example function. It needs to be a function for a little test because otherwise I only use the same data again and again. So in this case, it generates a new, again, random sales data array, my sales per category view. Here, after my chart, before the spacer, I'm going to add a button with action and label, system title and system image, refresh. So this is in case you have an app where the data is coming from a server. You can do this refreshing, fetching occasionally, for example, when the view appears or when you launch your application. But sometimes people want to more often see this, so having this kind of refresh button is an additional option. And then there's some kind of arrow with a frame max width of infinity, so it's actually in the center. And okay, I'm pushing this down with another padding of 30. Okay, now the question is, what do I do when I press this button? I said we want to get the data that is used in this chart, which is the sales data. That is my sales view model. The chart data, in order to do this a little bit more professionally, you probably have somewhere in this view model. Here I said in the initializer you would do the refetch, a fetch sales data function. I'm just going to use here to do get new data. And in this case, I'm going to fake this. So we test our UI first by changing the sales data to 3 months example, just changing this here. So this should update the data, which should update here the sales per category data. So then in my view model, I would call fetch the sales data. Let's try. And you see the data is updating. My chart is changing. This is not super nice because it just changes. If you want to have the changes to this data in this chart animated, I can use here with animation. And you can also specify what kind of animation, like bounce. This is one of the newer ones. And you see it actually bounces. I use the same data for my bar chart here. And again, I can do this. The nice thing about this animation is that users can see the changes more slowly and be more aware of that you actually changed something. The main point here is you can see how flexible these charts are. It nicely moves these charts on the right position. The bars are animating and also the axes are actually animating. So you see it stretches and squeezes depending on what it needs to do. Super easy. You simply need to change your data and the chart will do the rest for you. Now I want to talk about the last section, which is the total expenses. And in this case, I want to use a different kind of chart. One is here this area charts and then also line charts. Additionally, I want to use here a little table to give more detailed numbers. This expenses data is separate from my sales data. I'm going to use a separate view model to handle this, and I'm also going to show you a little bit of different strategies for data management. So let's start by creating another view model. This is Swift file. This is an expenses view model. It's a class expenses view model. I'm still using observable object, and the main data that I care about, or the data that I want to use here, is coming from these expenses. So I'm going to have an array of expenses, and we're using here some of this sample data. So this is var expenses. It's an array of expenses, and in the beginning I have an empty one. In the initializer or in a separate function, we would usually then fetch data from server. Right now I want to start simple and creating here a preview instance with some pre-populated data. So static var preview of type sales view model. View model is an expenses view model, and the view model's expenses I'm going to set to the year example, and then I'm returning this view model. I used the wrong type, so this is a expenses view model. These expense data is more realistic to a real-world application. The data that the user would collect, where in each expense we have the title, what category this was, fixed or variable, the amount, and the expense date. This is the raw data. But what I actually want to show in this is the expenses per month and per category. Ideally, the data that I want to see, if I add here a struct, expenses stats, identifiable because I work here with SwiftUI. So I want to have the month, integer. Then I want to know the fixed expenses for this month. This is a double. The variable expenses for this month, double, and then the total expenses I can just calculate as the sum of these two. Total expenses is also a double, and here I would just add fixed and variable expenses. Then I said this is an identifiable model, and I need to define here an ID. This is uniquely identifiable by the month. Int, and I return here the month. This data is very easy and understandable. If I would have then here one of my properties, the monthly, I need to name this here different, expense data as an array of exactly this expense stats. This is a data that I can easily use with my views. It's nicely formatted. I don't need to filter or sort something here. It's already done if we have this type. And my view model basically is there for taking the raw data and transforming it something that my views can extract and use very easily. That's the whole point with MVVM. This is one of the reasons MVVM is so useful, because the view model does some of the data manipulation or processing, and then the views only can concentrate on the defining the views, the UI part. Okay, so then the question is, how do I go from my expenses to my expenses stats? And again, we need to add a couple of functions. I already prepared this. You can just go to the GitHub and also copy this. It's more array manipulations. So first, what I want to have from my expenses array to this expenses stat is that I have here months. So I'm going to group them by month. This function takes all the expenses. It only uses the one from the given category, and it returns for each month the amount. So here I have to use the calendar to get the right month component for this event. And then I just append this sale to the month. Afterwards, I use here map to accumulate all of these values. And then I sort everything. So this is the data, an array of tuples. But in this case, I prefer to use this expenses stats. In this case, I have another function where I take both of the results from this function, one time for fixed and one time for variable, and generate one array of expense stats. So it's basically just a transformation. Okay, now I can use these two functions to move from my expenses type to my nicely and easy data expenses stats. I could have again used here computed properties, but I want to do this in a more efficient way. One of them is, as soon as my expenses changes, I want to update this array and evaluate this. So I'm going to use combine for this, because it makes it also very efficient, and you have more tools to make it efficient. Var subscriptions. This is a set of any cancelable. In the initializer, I'm creating a data stream so to always update when my expenses changes. Expenses. I'm going to use here on self, and I need to store this in my subscriptions. Okay. Whenever my expenses changes, I want to use these functions to update my monthly expenses data. Let fixed expenses self.expenses by month for fixed expenses, and let variable expenses self.expenses by month for variable expenses. And now I can combine these to the monthly expenses data by using the self.calculate the fixed expenses and the variable ones. This now gives me the monthly expenses per data string. And the last thing that I actually also wanted to show is here the total expenses. This is it published var total expenses. This is again a double, starting with 0. So I'm going to add here another function to calculate the total expenses from this expenses array. And basically, I'm just using here the reduce function to iterate over all these arrays and sum up the amount property. Again, when the expenses change here, I want to update this, calculate total expenses for the expenses. Okay, so now it's very efficient and only calculates this once I am changing here my expenses. You can also, for example, use here a remove duplicates or use a debounce or throttle for time filtering. The properties that I'm going to use in the views is only these two and not the expenses itself, so I can make this here private, similar to actually the subscriptions. So we only see from the view these two properties. You can also add to the function here private and access controls. Okay, this kind of data flows in your views is much more efficient and appropriate if you work with large data sets where you need to really optimize to not do too much work. So it's probably a good idea to go with this for a production app. Okay, now to the fun part of using this to create some interesting charts. So in my extensive stats group, I'm going to create a couple of SwiftUI view, starting with expenses line chart view. It is also possible to do something similar with a bar chart. Can also add this expenses bar chart view. Then I want to add a view with this table or this list. This is then a expenses detail grid view. And I should probably just give one view that for the detail expenses view. And then for the list, for the first view, for this card or for this section here, one view. This is a simple expenses line chart view. And we're actually going to start with this view. So again, I need to import charts. The data that we are using comes from the newly created expenses view model. So I'm adding here an observed var expenses view model of type expenses view model. And in the preview, I use this preview instance. Now here, I am going to use a vstack for the text and chart with an alignment of leading, starting with the text of your total expenses for the last year are plus. Now I use the data coming from the expenses view model's total expenses. There's definitely, I should have a little bit better formatted and I don't need to have so many digits after the point. So I'm going to use a string formatting, format of %.2f, which means two floating points after, and then the brackets afterwards. Now it's a little bit shorter. Can also add here a $sign. Then I make this bold and a foreground color of pink. Okay. Now the main thing is actually having here proof that this is the number, giving an idea with a chart. I can use the one for data. Expenses for the monthly data. This is an array of expense data. This is identifiable. Then this is a data point where I wanted to use an area marker. With the value, this is the month, and the Y is the expenses, and this is the total expenses for this month. Okay, let's add some formatting. In the preview, I add here padding, and for this frame, I think for the other ones, I always used something like a height of 70. Now I want to get rid of the axis. Chart x-axis visibility is hidden. Chart y-axis visibility is hidden. Although I probably should just uncomment the x1 so we understand why it does not fill out the whole area. And the main reason is that the axis trying to guess the areas they're supposed to draw. My data here, the first month is a 1. Per default, the axis will start at 0 and they will go in steps of 5 apparently until 15. For me, I don't care about this outside area. I want to go from 1 to 12. And for this, we use the charts X scale domain with a range of 1 to 12. And now the plot area is going from the beginning to the full end. And I can now hide my x-axis. Then the next thing is I would like to change the color here of this area. This is similar to before. You can change a foreground style of, for example, color.pink to use the same color as I use here for my foreground style. This might be a little bit pink. You can also add here gradient. This is a slight gradient, but for me it's still too strong. And I like to have a more specific definition of my gradient. If you use this foreground styles, you can use different styles, and one of them is actually a gradient, as you see here. So let's define our own gradient. Let linear gradient is a linear gradient with color, start point and end point. So you have here a color array, for example, a pink with an opacity of 0.7, and then a color dot pink with an opacity of 0. The start point, this is a unit point where you can say, do I start my first color in this array? Where should it start? On the top leading edge and going down to the bottom trailing edge. And this is now nicely usable in my foreground style. My color gradient goes from the top leading edge to the bottom trailing edge. I probably just want to have a top to bottom. So top to bottom. Maybe I don't want to have to fade out so much, just a little bit. This kind of gradient styles we can also use together with the line charts. I'm going to show you an example in a minute. And now let's add this one in our main app flow together with the expenses line chart view. Detail expenses view. I'm just going to add here this view model access to observable object var expenses view model of type expenses view model with this preview. Okay, now I have these two views that I want to use in my content view with another section. And this time I'm using as the destination my detail expenses view with an instance of expenses view model. I did not create this here, but we can just add this again as a state object var expenses view model. Expenses view model. For now we are again using here this dummy data from the preview. I have now something I can pass down in my subview, and the label is the simple expenses line chart view coming up here. This looks great because I use also this gradient styles for the other views. Now let's work on the charts for the detail view, and we are starting with the expenses line chart view. Again, importing here charts. Now I am going to copy the code we had for the simple expenses view. This is a good starting point. And what I want to use is here these charts. I also need to actually have the expenses view model. Adding this also with the preview data. I'm going to remove the linear graded and I'm going to change to a line mark. Okay, again we do the aspect ratio of 1 with content mode to fit, and I add here padding. These are the total expenses, and I actually did not want to use this. I want to use these individual ones. Now if I add here one time for a fixed and one time for variable, it's just going to use both of these values because it treats them as one continuous line. You can change this by adding the foreground style by value expenses, and this is fixed and this is now variable. This helps it to distinguish that these are actually two different lines. Now the next thing I might want to do is actually adding here a symbol. Now instead of a line I could have also used a scatter plot. If you want to use both, there is an easy trick where you can use the symbol by, because I want to have two different symbols. This is expenses. It's actually exactly the same as above. You just need to always have the same names, the same string values, and it chooses here circle and square. According to Apple, they said it's good for accessibility. Imagine somebody's colorblind, they can't really see which one is which one. And now you have here, this is circle and this is square, and they actually can see here the circle and square in the legend, nicely also with these colors. If you want to make this even more visible, there's a couple of other things. For example, You can add a line style, again with different ones, or a stroke style. For example, if you want to have here something with a dash, and then you can, for example, create 20 and 40 dash lines. Okay, this is most probably a little bit too much, and so now here you have a dashed line. And this is probably not the best one to choose. I think there's also a line width of 4, which has to be in different order. No, there is too small, so I probably should go 10 and 10. Okay, together with this dashed face does not make sense with my symbols here. So I'm just going to take out the dashed, but I hope you get an idea that you can customize these lines quite a lot. So now I have here this line width changes. I probably should use the same for the other one. And I'm using here plot. So this is similar to group, where you want to add this kind of stylings to multiple of your subviews. This is also, for example, useful if you want to change the interpolation method for this kind of line charts. For example, you can go, it's already using linear, cardinal, now it's trying to smooth them out. Let's just go for 2 for the line width. So to see this a bit better, then we have step center, so it's really just stepping. Again, this probably doesn't make sense together with this symbols. Let's just go with cut mule roam. This is a way of interpolation styles. Since we are already so good in customizing this chart for the styling, something else that you might want to do, which I didn't show you yet, is how to change the colors of your charts. So this is chart foreground style scale, giving here an array and of dictionaries. So this is variable. I probably really should start using something else instead of just copy pasting the strings to purple. And fixed is size. Okay, it crashed because it was trying to access something from this, forcing to access something in this dictionary that I did not add. So you have to add all of these expenses, all of these variables. Okay, now you see we have different colors. This would be, for example, also useful for changing the bar colors here. I only need to change the book category by, what do I have, fiction, display name, because this is the one it's okay, yeah, I'm not done, thank you. Okay, I'm just going to close the canvas for a minute. So this would be purple, then book category biography.display name. Okay, I added now the 4. Let's see if this is working. Okay. So you see, you can say which colors, which categories, which color. You probably could add this as an extension to this book category, or just store this style somewhere else instead of me here doing this manually. This has the advantage that for my updating, before it was actually, when it switched positions of this category, the colors were updating, and now it doesn't because it sticks with the same colors for categories. So if you refresh this here, for example, now these colors were the same as previously, they would have switched. Here again, they just stick with the same colors. Okay, going back to the expenses line chart view and more fancy appearance modifications. I did here override the foreground style to set some custom ones. You can do the same with the symbols to say which symbol you want to use. So in this case, I used the chart symbol scale. This is with my two types. One time I use the circle and otherwise the square. This is not there per default, so you have to define your own chart symbol shape. This is from the example from the WWDC demo project. Okay, the next area I want to customize is actually my axis. And especially I want to format my months here properly, starting with only showing the area from 0 to 13. So I don't want to go to 15. This is with chart X scale domain 0 to 13. Okay, updating. Then the main thing is now I want to here change the labels of this axis. And we're going to do something similar where I did this formatting, date formatting. So I need to have a date formatter, and I create a function where I take the number and return the string, which is the short standalone month symbol. Okay, this we can now use in our chart x-axis content, where I have to start with an axis marks of values, because with values you can specify which values you want to show. For example, I want to show the months 1, 4, 7, and 12. I get now here the value. This is of undefined type, so I will need to here typecast to something that I passed, and it's basically the same type as here in my x value. So it's this type, which is an integer. So if let number is value as int self axis label with title key. You have here also stuff like collision, orientation, maybe it's probably too many. It's title, if it's centered or not, centered is always good. Centered is 2. So this is now my month for this number. Okay, I have now January, April, July. In order to see this better, I'm going to also add here a grid. So this is again in this axis mark, the axis grid lines. What works if you set the anchor to top? Now it's centering them. I have here this grid lines exactly at this for values and my labels at this for values. So maybe you can always change this and also add here different ones. As you see, it's quite flexible at deciding where you exactly want to have this ticks and this labels. You can also add here ticks. Then it goes a little bit below. You see the line extends to the label. You can do the same for the y-axis, maybe not with the values, just do this automatically. And in this case, yeah, it's crashing. Variable expenses, jump to the definition, this is a double. So my y, I am just using the default values, it's picking. This is a double, and I'm just showing here this number. Okay, for example, what would you want to do with this? I could divide this with 1000 and then just use an integer and add a k. So I just want to show in thousands. So now it says 20k, 15k, 10k, 5k and 0k. You could show and hide this k for only showing it for the last one, for example. This is probably enough for this one chart. I still wanted to show you the same version for bar chart. So let's copy this whole stuff into the bar chart. Import charts and also this view model for the preview. Let's take out the line styles, and I'm changing this here to bar with an aspect ratio of 1, content mode of fit. Per default, it's going to stack them, but I want to have them as 2 different stacks. And for this, we can use another of these symbol variations. Actually, I don't need to have the symbol variations, the foreground style variations. So in this case, I use the position by. Now it's just the same. Don't need to plot. Then I want to format this axis. Same style here. Only that this time I'm using this for my directly for my month. It's crashing because now I use 2 different ones. Sometimes it's just too fast and annoying. Okay. Now it's happy. And you see here this month data. It's probably a little bit too cramped, as you see. If you would only show like 4 months, it's probably okay. But you see, you have now 2 different bars for fixed and variable. Okay, definitely not the best choice in this case for this data. This line chart is better. If you actually want to add here an area chart, you can add an area. Just need to take out one of them. And now you see you have the overlay of this area and this line. So instead of this foreground style, I am going to use here color.yellow, for example, .gradient. Okay. Similar to this gradient. You can also use one like this here. I'm going to use cyan because this is the one we had, and then make it really opaque on the bottom. So now that I can use this linear gradient, and you see they're overlapping. This is a way of making this nice faded backgrounds, probably too much. Just changing the opacity from the first color You can also add more color stops. This is a good example. In my case, with these two graphs, it looks a little bit too much. So I'm going to just stick with these two line marks. Now that we have our little chart view, I also want to give you an additional idea for complex data analysis in your app. And this is this kind of tables. You could use the SwiftUI table, which is for macOS and the iPad in full screen mode. For the iPhone, we can't use that. It would just show a list, one-dimensional list. This kind of table I made with a grid view. So let's work on this in the expenses grid view here. Same as before, I need my data. Observed object var expenses view model. This is of type expenses view model. Okay. Now the view that I want to use is grid, and we're going to use all of the parameters like alignment, horizontal spacing, vertical spacing, and content. So the alignment is the default alignment. Let's say trailing, horizontal spacing of 15 and 10. Inside my grid, I'm adding grid rows. And what we're starting off with, the data that I want to show, is in my expenses view model, the monthly expenses data. This is the main one. So this is data in. Now for each of these data points, what I had in here was the total sales, a total expensive, the fixed expensive, and the flexible ones. So we have 3 different values, and actually the month. You define each row, grid row, starting with the month. This is the data's month. This is again a number. Let's just go and take this number formatting here. Maybe I just should have moved this in the view model so I don't have to copy this over. So this is the month for this number. Okay, we have now a nice list of our 12 months. Alignment is trailing because I set it to on this. You could have also used leading. No, okay, let's just go back and add more stuff before I show you all this customization. Then I can use here the texts for, and I want to show all these numbers. Again, I'm going to use here string format. So this is %.2f for 2 digits. And the data that I want to show is the fixed expenses. And then I wanted to show the variable expenses and the total expenses. Nice. We have now 4 columns for 4 entries here for each of these rows. I also want to have 2 more above for the header. Let's do this. Oh, no, this is before my for each. And here I add a grid row content. So I could, for example, add here 3 text. I want to have here 3 header texts, but for my first column, for January, I don't want to have anything. So I can add here empty or placeholder color.clear. And I still need to set it how to use the space. So this is grid cell unisized axis, and this is vertical and horizontal, so it's not supposed to take up more space. As you see now, I have these columns nicely aligned to each other. If you want to change the alignment style in one of these cells, you can change the grid cell anchor to center, and now the fixed label here is in the center. You can also do the same to the other headings. This is overwriting the value that I gave in the main grid initializer here. Okay, last I want to add here a divider, and then I also wanted to show on the lower part a sum of everything. So this is another grid row saying text total bold, and then I want to show the expense view model's total sum again with bold foreground style of pink. Now this is automatically setting it to the second column, and I need to add here again a placeholder similar to before. And for the first column, now it moved it to the second. What I need to do is tell it that this view takes up 2 columns, so I can use the grid cell columns count for 2, take up 2 column space, and now it moves to the last one. Going to add another divider. Okay, as you see, you can easily add here 1 grid row for the header, this for each, for the main content, and then one grid row for the summing up everything. Okay, we have now all the views, and I can actually use this here in my detail view. And I'm going to use here a list. It needs to be something scrollable because my content is too big. And this is my expense detail grid view with the expense view model. So it's down here. Then doing some styling for this list of list style plain. If you want to get rid of this spacer here, we can add this in. I'm going to move these into sections, adding here also a title. If you want to customize, for example, the list row insets and stuff, we can add more modifier inside. So I need to apply this to both of them, which means I need to have a group. And now this is nicely styled. And I can test running the whole application. I'm going here in my detail for my total expenses. We have this line chart and this nice little grid. This is more an advanced example for charts because I used a lot of the customization for the line styling, line colors, and also this axis, what values are shown, what grid lines are shown, what labels are used. As you see, you can do quite a lot of things, as long as you know what to change, what the chart modifiers are. This project for me won't currently run on macOS because I did not install the macOS beta version. But the project files that I put on GitHub, they will also work for macOS 13. I just put a lot of flags for availability to make sure it works. Okay, this is a wrap. We built a lot of things in this tutorial with this project, talking a lot about data management, what kind of data we need to prepare for charts to work. A lot of it does work automatically, like here for the bar charts, where you can easily go over the week. In some cases, I did do the customization because here I need to anyway understand for each week what the sales data is, so we need anyway do the data manipulation. I also showed you a lot of the newer features, like here this interaction where I can do some selection. You can also do the same with pie charts, a little bit more calculation involved because you get the angle. This interaction is new for iOS 17, similar to scrollable charts. Here I also showed you how to get the time range that is currently shown in this charts. Another way of doing interactable charts is, for example, with this weekday statistics, where I added here toggles to show and hide certain information in my charts, fading in and fading out. If your data changes, charts automatically update this and you can nicely animate this. This was what I showed you an example for this pie charts and this bar charts, where it animates between changes, including the axis. Pie charts are another new feature for iOS 17 and macOS 14. And lastly, I showed you a different example for data handling, where we created our custom type to collect the information that I need. This can really depend on the application. Maybe the server already provides you with the information that you want and you do the statistics analysis on the server, or you can also do this on the device. It's a little bit of array manipulation, filtering, reducing, grouping. And in this example, I used the line charts with multiple data points and also showed you how to create a grid for more details. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a like and subscribe. Good job for making it to the end. Until next time, happy coding.